During the past few years, computers have been getting less and less affordable, with graphics card prices going up because of crypto mining and the RTX 2000 release setting new pricing standards. And alongside this, flash memory has also been either unaffordable or nearly free, switching between the two seemingly every year. Most components have at some point become unaffordable, and for some, like graphics cards, they never came back from their worst. I miss pre-Turing pricing. And now we are back at it. AI is stealing all of the memory, so RAM, storage, yes, even hard drives, GPUs, CPUs, and anything that uses flash memory are going up in price. While in the meantime, because of this, companies are literally ceasing production for the consumer. Global Crucial, you are one of the best. With all of this, RAM is now a luxury, and you'll probably have to spend as much as your graphics card to get an usable amount of RAM. But what is a usable amount of RAM? Well, it does depend on your use case, but for gaming, it might not be as much as you think. I've benchmarked a few RAM configurations going from 16GB all the way down to 4GB. I would have added 24GB to the test, but I had to let go of one of my sticks, so that I have to do. All of the RAM configurations run at a frequency of 2686 and timings of CL18, and are sticks of DDR4. They were this bad because I intended to use an old stick of RAM that became unstable, but it seems to have finally died and I didn't want to rerun my tests at a higher frequency. The configurations will be 4GB single channel, 8GB single channel, 16GB dual channel. I actually think the 8GB configuration had some framerate disadvantages because of the single channel. In combination to this, the tests ran on an i5-12400F and an RX 6700 XE. For the testing conditions, the background processes were Discord, Spotify, Steam, and the anti-cheat Vanguard, as well as any additional launcher the game may have required. The patch file was on an NVMe SSD and about 40GB. The games were all at the settings I used to play them, so most of them were maxed out outside of competitive shooters, and with the exception of Red Dead. All of that is going to be done on Windows 10. I gathered the frame time data for some of the games, mostly those that had a route that was easy to replicate, so I'll start by the ones that don't have more than FPS and footage with the MSI frame time graph. Starting with one of the less surprising results, Dead by Daylight. I used to play this game using a Q6600 and 4GB of DDR2 on Windows 10, so it's not surprising that the game ran perfectly fine using 4GB of RAM. The menus were a little stuttery, but the game was perfectly fine. In terms of frame rate, I was not surprised by the performance of 4GB, but 16GB, which was much greater than the other two. I'm pretty sure this is due to single versus dual channel, and I will definitely test this again in the future. 4 and 8GB were pretty much the same at 90 and 84 FPS average respectively, while 16GB was at 120. The 1% loads were 45, 26 and 71. Here, 4GB did better than 8 overall, but let's remember that the game is multiplayer and was benchmarked on different maps, and the 4GB run was longer, so the numbers stabilized. Overall, they perform pretty much the same, as shown by the average and the graph on screen. The difference in lows is my bad. Next up is Apex Legends. For my runs, I tried landing in the same spot and roughly going in the same way. The game was not so surprisingly playable with 4GB of RAM. There was pretty much no stuttering and the frame time graph was pretty much flat. Landing into the island was perfectly smooth, and even dying, which is a thing that often stutters in games, was perfectly fine here. Being fairly smooth overall, there is nothing of note for 8 and 16GB. It's perfectly smooth. The frame rates were of 75, 85 and 133 for the averages, and the 1% were of 6, 38 and 70. In this example, we also see 16GB being much higher than the others, and I still think this is due to dual channel versus single. Battlefield 6 is a weird one, as the first time I ran the game, it was somewhat playable, although it had some strange lags where the game's logic stutters, while the game itself renders fine. Afterwards though, I had to clear my shaders because of a bug with Cyberpunk, and Battlefield 6 ended up crashing my entire computer during compilation, so I couldn't get in-game anymore. 8 and 16GB were fine, although the game really doesn't like benchmarking tools. 8GB also has weird stuttering issues, where the game doesn't stutter, but the game's logic is pretty slow for some reason, and the game is sort of playable but not really. It did however run at an average of 47 and 112 FPS for 16GB of RAM, and the minimum 12 of 17 and 60. The finals ran, but not that well. There were some stutters that were way too frequent, and that cost me a lot of joules. The game ran very well, but that was in between stutters. But double the RAM once again, and the game is fairly playable. No stutters, the frame time graph is pretty good. the game is playable. The averages were 54, 82 and 117 for 4, 8 and 16 gigs, and the lows were 0, 31 and 50. This is another game where I couldn't replicate the footage, but the difference do seem quite high, and they will require more testing to figure out. It's between 4 and 8 GB in single channel. Hogwarts Legacy, I kind of messed up the testing on this one and was not able to repeat the path I took with 4 GB of RAM, so my frame rates are not really the most trustworthy. But it was nearly playable with 4 GB of RAM. Unfortunately though, there were some frequent stutters, and while it took me through the intro, the stutters were way too noticeable. 8 GB onwards though, and absolutely no problem once again. The FPSs, although not super accurate, were of 79, 96 and 131. While the lows were of 26, 58 and 59. Fortnite was just one long stutter. It took a while to go in game, and once you're loaded a match, you're already in the air, since you took so long to load. Once you hit the ground though, well, the game's not much more playable. You'll hit second long stutters. The game is just unplayable with 4 GB of RAM. But once again, double up the RAM and it runs perfectly fine. I didn't bother recording the 1 FPS figure for the 4 GB config, but however, 8 and 16 may have shown difference between single and dual channel yet again. This requires more testing though, but the difference is massive. The averages were 58, 168, and the lows were of 1 and 58. And finally, before getting to the slightly more interesting tests, Escape from Tarkov. I've always heard that this game was quite RAM hungry, and well, I don't see it. With 4 GB of RAM, getting in the game took about 20 minutes, which is pretty long, but once in game, it's actually pretty playable. There were a lot of stutters, but not so much that the game is unplayable. It wasn't necessarily that bothering, and the game would absolutely be playable if not for the insane loading time. And of course, as usual, 8 and 16 gigs had no problems. Frame rates were of 26, 41 and 75, and the lows of 2, 20 and 46. I had some issues with my 8 gig recording, while the audio is fine but the video is corrupted, and I didn't want to go back to record again, so just trust the numbers. Now for the rest of the games, I have a frame time graph, but I messed up making them, so they'll most likely be useful to look at the game's performance with one config, but will not be comparable. This will be fixed in the future, but doesn't matter that much anyway. Starting with 7 Days to Die. I really think that the fact that I ran the game at maximum settings helps it with all the configurations, even 16 GB as there were some stutters anyway. Possibly more than what I had with 34 gigs of RAM, but that game isn't the most optimized, so I have some doubts about the stutters. Anyway, with 4 GB the game was absolutely unplayable. It stuttered heavily every 10 seconds, and I was always stopping dead in my tracks whenever I tried to work. 8 GB was slightly better, but still stuttery. Although this time the stutters were bearable and not really hindering the experience. And 16 GB was, while still very stuttery somehow, pretty much the same as 8 GB, maybe slightly better. The graphs showed 2 peaks at about the same time, up to around 30 milliseconds with some massive peaks that could go over 100 milliseconds. The game could be considered playable with 8 GB of RAM. As from memory, it at least performed similarly with 24 GB. Frame rate wise though, we've got 50, 80 and 100 on average, and 4, 10 and 30 for the 1%. Cyberpunk 2077 was almost playable with 4 GB of RAM, but unfortunately heavy stutters were way too frequent. I did go through the entire intro, but the slowdowns ended up being way too much for me to play. With 8 GB of RAM, I would consider it perfectly playable, but looking at the frame times, it ended up slightly worse and less consistent than 60 GB. Peaks in frame times were also more consistent, meaning that there were some true stutters that 16 GB just did not have, with 8 GB being around the 15 milliseconds range on average, while 16 was at 10. It did peak at around 50 milliseconds, but my testing of this wasn't perfect and I unfortunately did not record the benchmark run. I however don't record the game stuttering at all, even if it clearly happened. In terms of frame rate, we've got 57, 83 and 126 on average, to 44 and 88 for the 1%. This still ran mostly fine with 4 GB of RAM, but micro stuttering made it a little hard to aim smoothly. There were however no big stutters, and dual channel or maybe a frame cap will help. Not that I would recommend that with CS though. Looking at the frame time graphs, we see that there were multiple stutters that would definitely be noticeable. 8 GB in comparison is a lot smoother with no perceptible stutters. The game was playing as usual and didn't feel that off compared to 4 GB. 16 GB takes a step further with lower average frame times, but this may once again be a single versus dual channel issue. In terms of FPS, we've got 130, 115 and 155, while the 1% were 43, 53 and 171. dayz is a game expected to perform well with 4GB of RAM, as I used to play that with Q6600, and it turns out that it was. Though it had some stuttering, the worst peak was when I opened inventory, which is to be expected with 4GB of RAM. I would call this game quite playable with 4GB. And of course 8GB was perfectly playable, although I unfortunately don't have the frame times for this one, as Presence Mode decided not to record the numbers. 16GB once again is perfectly smooth, with peaks up to 20 milliseconds that were absolutely not noticeable. Averages with 107, 116, 162 and 1% out of 59, 54 and 68. GTA 5 Enhanced is surprisingly unplayable. The legacy version is perfectly playable with 4GB, but this one is full of stutters and absolutely unplayable. The massive peaks on the graph show how horrible it was. 8GB once again, however, is making a lot more playable, to the point where I didn't notice anything during gameplay, even though the graph is slightly worse than 16GB again, which, while also pretty smooth, has a lot of peaks, but overall still quite playable. The frame rates were 21, 59 and 101, and the 1% were 1, 30 and 46. Next we have Red Dead Redemption 2, which warned me as I launched the game that 4GB wasn't enough, and I didn't listen. It definitely wasn't enough, until I made the page file bigger. However, it was actually quite playable. There were a lot of stutters, but I do think the game is sort of playable. Going up to 8 though, and all of it is fixed, with nothing else to be noted other than the settings could be cranked up with no problem. And then we have 16GB of RAM, which continues the trend of running at a higher frame rate with more consistent frame times. Average was 43, 43 again, and 96, while the lows are 4, 14 and 50. And finally, Rust. This, once again, ran just fine on my Q6600 and 4GB of DDR2, and even the same run config I'm using right now, although I had a G4560. But in the recent years, it has gotten more and more RAM heavy. A few years ago the loadings were slow, but the game was playable. Nowadays, it doesn't even load anything past the main menu before crashing. 8GB of RAM was better, until 2 years ago. It was playable with some stuttering, but it was perfectly bearable. However, now it's hardly playable. The stuttering has gotten really bad, although I'm sure it comes down after a few minutes, just like it used to. I don't think the average person would want to wait for that game to be playable though. 16GB was better, but not free of stuttering. At least on this 500 pop server. It did calm down after some time, and more importantly had no severe stutter, and I could sit about, and that's something that the 8GB config couldn't do. But this game loves RAM, and I would at least recommend 24GB of RAM for this mess, as I had this set up and the game used about 17GB on average. The frame rates were of 23 and 56, while the 1% were of 0 and 10. So what's the minimum amount of RAM you can get away with? I'd say it's still 8GB. Every game was playable and they ran with no issues, besides Rust. Rust being the game that made me buy more RAM in the first place, as I couldn't tab out of a game after a few hours of gameplay. So, depending on what you're willing to deal with, I'd consider it playable as well. But if you're building a new system there, I would recommend going for a bare minimum of 16, so it is not that much more expensive to get 2x8 compared to 1x8. Getting a single stick of 16GB now and another one later when the prices go back down, it's definitely something to be considered, as normally it will be quite affordable. It just depends on how long you are willing to wait.